Well, a very good morning to everyone, and thanks for joining us for the Townsville Enterprise webinar on economic recovery from COVID-19 with a particular focus on regional Australia. My name is Wade Chiesa. I'm the Director of Regional Development and Investment at Townsville Enterprise, and thanks for joining us this morning. We've got a great panel we have for you this morning. Well, hasn't COVID changed the way countries think about doing business? And I guess Australia's no different. Comments about being more globally competitive, self-sufficient, manufacturing and the concept of reshoring and the importance of regions have really been thrust into the spotlight by COVID-19. But what's required to make this happen? What government investment in infrastructure, what policy framework is required to ensure that our economic recovery is a strong one and sets up the country for a prosperous future? Today, we're lucky to be joined by our nation's business leaders to discuss economic recovery from COVID-19. And we have a wonderful panel, and I'd like to welcome them here today. I'd like to say hello to Neville Power. He's the chair of the federal government's National COVID-19 Commission Advisory Board. The Commission is concentrating its effort on supporting the government's plans for Australia's economic recovery and getting as many people back into jobs as quickly as possible. And Nev, welcome today, and you're very familiar with the North and Northwest, so great to have you with us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'd also like to welcome Jennifer Westacott, and Jennifer's the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. The Business Council of Australia represents Australia's largest employers advocating for good policy of the business community and the Australians they employ. And Jennifer's very much a big advocate for this region. Great to have you with us, Jennifer.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And I'd also like to welcome Patricia O'Callaghan, the CEO of Townsville Enterprise, and we welcome you here today as well, Trish.
Thanks, Wade.
At this stage, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet and pay our respects to those elders past, present and future. To get us underway, I'd like to hand over to Trish, who will welcome us all here today. Thanks, Trish.
Thanks for that, Wade, and good morning to all of our viewers who have dialed in this morning. We do have a great session lined up, so it's going to be a jam-packed hour and looking forward to hearing from you as well. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land we meet, the elders past and present. We have a number of mayors that have dialed in, a number of our elected officials, distinguished guests, and of course our members that have tuned in for this morning. So a great crowd, and hopefully we can get a bit interactive a little bit later. I think, as Wade noted, today's theme is around economic recovery in North Queensland. And for many of us that call the North home, this is certainly a topic that we have been discussing, not just within the last 6 months, but over the past decade. I think for us, whether it was cyclones, flooding, economic downturns, and now a pandemic, there's certainly not a crisis the people of the North haven't experienced. But despite these challenges, we as a community do remain strong. I know the word gets bandied around a lot around resilience, but we just take each of these crises as they come, we pick ourselves up and we keep moving. And we can see that we are resilient because we are certainly optimistic about our future and where we need to go. I think what's also really important and something that the North is doing well is that we tackle these issues as a united community. And it was only 4 weeks ago, just as restrictions started easing, that the North did come together to put a package of policies and projects to government, both state and federal, for consideration around economic recovery. It was our Task Force NQ, our Economic Recovery Group, chaired by our Mayor, Jenny Hill, the North Queensland Regional Councils, our 5 LGAs, chaired by Councillor and Mayor Lynn McLaughlin, and the business community that got together, put those projects and policies to government, and then went to Parliament House to launch to all levels of government and parties. And I've got to say that Unlock the North campaign, it certainly feels like the message is getting through to government, and they do seem to be listening. I think it was only yesterday we had the Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, in the region with the Treasurer, Cameron Dick, delivering the state government's economic recovery plan for Townsville in the North. And what a great number of announcements that were made. We saw $30 million committed to Big Rocks Weir, which is the first part of that Hells Gates Dam vision, but that Weir alone will open up agriculture and secure water for the Charters Towers region, with matched funding by the Commonwealth already committed by the Prime Minister. This is about opening up ag, and I know a theme we'll discuss today. We saw Glencore keep their doors open on the smelter, over 1,000 jobs locked in with Incitec Pivot and that supply chain. Great news, and a lot of families in Mount Isa and Townsville sleeping a lot easier last night. And we also saw Drive It and Q. That's a project about rebuilding our tourism economy. It's already got match funding sitting there, and they can get on with the job now. So we do feel that that we are moving forward. This is about jobs for the North. These weren't election commitments. They can get on with the job now. And whilst we have a long road ahead of us, it's certainly a great step in the right direction for jobs in the North and Northwest. So I think as we head into the discussion this morning, the stats are fairly real here in the North. We do still see about 21,000 of us that are on JobKeeper payments. We know as that winds back, we have to be even more prepared for what recovery looks like. We entered 2020 with jobs and unemployment going the right way. But, you know, we are now seeing again double digits of unemployment as a result of the pandemic, 6,000 jobs lost alone in the latest ABS. So it's great to see that we do have some plans and roadmaps. I do want to acknowledge Nev, who's on the webinar with us today. Nev, you and I called Mount Isa home for some time. You know the North intimately and have a lot of knowledge and experience. So we look forward to hearing from you. And Jennifer, we're adopting you as a North Queenslander. You're up here as much as you can. I know those borders have made things a bit difficult, but through your national platform, you have very much put the spotlight on the regions. And I don't think these commitments would be coming as much as they are without your support. So look forward to the discussion this morning and also interacting with a number of the people who are online. Thanks, Wade.
Thanks very much, Trish. And of course, you'll have your opportunity to post a question through the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar as well. So if you feel free to put those questions, and we'll do as best we can to get through them. Now it's time to hear from Neville Power. Nev's going to give an update on what the COVID Coordination Commission Advisory Board has been doing and some of the challenges and opportunities that Australia faces for economic recovery. A little bit about Nev. As I said, he's the chair of the COVID Coordination Commission. Born and raised in Queensland, he operates a cattle station. He has a background in agribusiness, mining and aviation. He's the chair of the Perth Airport and Foundation, the Foundation for the WA Museum and the Royal Flying Doctors Federation. He was a previous CEO of Fortescue Metals, where they more than quadrupled production and achieved engagement with Aboriginal communities. He was named the WA Business Leader of the Year in 2016, and he's a fierce advocate for health and development of regional and Aboriginal communities. Nev, thanks for your time, and I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Wade, and thanks, Tricia, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk to you today. Let me pay my respects to traditional owners as well. I'm here at Double Yerrigan, and our traditional owners here are the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. So acknowledge those where everyone's meeting today. The COVID Commission changed its role in July to a focus more predominantly around economic recovery. Up until then, excuse me, we had been equally focused on problem solving in the economy and looking at how we could try and protect people's jobs, protect businesses, to minimise the damage that was being caused by the imposition of restrictions around the coronavirus. Come July, we thought that we were doing pretty well and that we started to refocus much more strongly on economic recovery. And that's where our focus has been since then, although I'd have to say the last couple of months we have renewed our focus on damage control around Victoria, and we've been helping there to the best we can with getting business engagement with the Victorian government and establishing networks within the business community to try and support and augment the efforts of state health. I think we have the opportunity, and we now have the knowledge of how to do that more quickly. And if we have further second waves or, God forbid, third waves, there is a inherent capacity now within the systems, I think, to respond more quickly. But we consistently need to get state health and governments of all persuasions to really understand the best way to approach closures and reopening around the coronavirus. And that is, from our view, a risk-based approach. There are some activities which represent the highest risk of spread of the coronavirus, where there's a lot of social interaction. There are other activities such as agriculture, mining, large-scale construction, road construction, and a lot of other activities that don't represent high risk and, in our view, should be maintained. So I think trying to encourage that approach at any opportunity you have when talking to our health officials, our state and federal officials is worthwhile. So our focus now on economic recovery is around a number of key trends and themes in the economy. We know that some parts of the economy are going to be impacted for a long period of time to come. Anything to do with international travel, for example, is going to take quite some time to recover, whereas other parts of the economy have been in boom times and are actually way above where we were this time last year. So we need to think about how we transition people and reskill people from those areas of the economy that have been impacted, let's say airlines and airports and international tourism operations, into those where we can see demand and strength coming, and to try and accelerate and make that transition as smooth as we can. For example, we know that Australians spend $20 billion a year more travelling overseas than international visitors do coming to Australia. And that's across business, visiting friends and relatives, and tourism and events. So we need to repackage our product in Australia to make sure that we're able to capture and attract as many domestic events and tourism and adventures as we can in Australia, because it won't happen naturally, and we need to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success and getting as much of that 20 billion as we can. And I think this is about packaging and promoting regions and making sure that when people come to a region like Townsville, that they take an opportunity to see all of the things that are there to see: adventure, sports, arts, sightseeing, everything that there is. We should be making sure that we're packaging that. And when this happened in New Zealand, one of the key things that worked very well for them was actually setting targets of what that expenditure per day from visitors was going to be, or expenditure per say. So I think those are the sorts of areas that we can do. In addition, we want to reset our advanced manufacturing, and we're not talking about 1950s production lines, high volume production lines. We're talking about energy intensive manufacturers. Australia still imports the vast majority of our fertiliser. So despite the fact that we're a major agricultural country, we import most of the fertilisers and agrichems that we need. So there's a tremendous opportunity to have multiple large-scale nitrogen fertiliser manufacturing, phosphate fertiliser manufacturing. And just to reinforce what Trish said, I was absolutely delighted that the support was there to get Glencore along for another copper smelter reline, which keeps the copper smelter open, the copper refinery open, and the Incitec pivot at Phosphate Hill, the Duchess plant for phosphate fertilisers open. So that is a core piece of manufacturing that we have here in Australia that, pardon me, has been preserved. If we think about the region as well, some of the things that we've been working on with other areas of government is the whole infrastructure package. And I think North Queensland has a tremendous opportunity here. There are enormous opportunities, as Trish said, with water. And we think that that can be combined with pumped hydro and virtual power stations from solar to provide fully firmed renewable electricity generation in the north. That can be fed back into the grid to support lower cost, more reliable energy in the north, but also back into the grid to the south, so that the area can be a major exporter of electricity. One of the things that we've talked about in our energy advice that we've provided to government is that if we build major solar farms in the middle of Queensland and we firm it with pumped hydro in the middle of Tasmania, we end up with massive transmission systems to join the two up, huge losses, and power bills that have got a high amount of fixed cost. And already today, Australians pay around 40% of their power bill goes into the infrastructure of distribution and transmission. So even getting very low cost renewables, we're not going to see that translated into low cost of electricity for households and businesses. So those are the areas that we've been focusing on. We have already submitted all of our advice around energy, gas, manufacturing. We're working in higher education and research, small to medium enterprises, and the tourism and regions areas, as well as the workforce trends that I mentioned before. A major focus of ours coming forward will be on small to medium enterprises, where we recognise that this is a sector of the economy that's been very hard hit. There's a significant representation through tourism and regions, but we also believe this will be one of the fastest responding areas of the economy, because small businesses are very agile, very flexible. So we're looking at how we can provide advice to those businesses so that they know what the financial metrics are for their business going forward. They can overlay that with their views on the market and very quickly come to a view about whether they should be taking on more debt to accelerate their business through it, or what are the conditions that they need to see for them to start investing and employing. Because we believe that if we can create the right environment for small businesses to be recruiting and investing in their business, even if it's a major change from where they were going before, that's the fastest way that we'll restore those jobs, particularly in areas like North Queensland. Right now, I think while it's improved with the cases in Victoria and New South Wales getting better, we're still very much in the fog. It's very hard to look outside of what we're seeing with the coronavirus and work out what are the market conditions that are going to prevail on the other side. So our advice to businesses are to constantly be looking for those clues. We're starting to do some comparison work with overseas to see what's been happening in those trends to get an understanding of it. But I think it's about trying to project out past the coronavirus, not necessarily with a vaccine, but how do we live with this long term? How do we set up our businesses to be as physically distanced, that we can communicate with people, that we've got ways of testing and tracing and isolation very quickly, so that we can help and augment government's efforts in controlling spreads of the virus when it comes out. And to look at how we can reconfigure our businesses, how do we capture those markets that are there, so that we're able to deal with the virus and live with it for perhaps the next 12 months, if it takes that long to find a cure or a vaccine. So I think right now is the time to be assessing that, putting those plans in place, accepting that this is a major shock to the economy and a major shock to our businesses. So we need to treat it like any other major business shock and think about how we can reconfigure and reposition. So look, I'll leave it at that. As we go forward, we'll continue. All of our commissioners engage very widely, and we have them spread across those work streams. And I'd give an open opportunity for anyone that wants to provide input to the Commission. Please do so. Do it through Townsville Enterprise. That's a great way to do it. But we're more than happy to try and help and do anything that we can to support you. We don't have a pot of money to spend. We don't. We aren't government. We don't make the decisions, but we are able to put a business input and a business perspective directly into the policy and decision making. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nev. We look forward to you coming back for the panel as well. We've got some questions on that. So thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome Jennifer Westacott, the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. She's an advocate for stronger and fairer society through a more prosperous Australia. She's held senior leadership positions in New South Wales and Victorian governments, and was a senior partner at KPMG, where she advised major corporations on climate change and sustainability, and advised governments across Australia on significant reform priorities. She's an adjunct professor in the City Futures Research Centre of the University of New South Wales. She's the inaugural chair of the Board of Studio Schools of Australia, patron of Mental Health Australia, the co-patron of Pride and Diversity, and a patron of the Pinnacle Foundation. And in 2018, was made an officer, an AO, in the General Division of the Order of Australia. very, very busy lady. We appreciate your time, Jennifer. And as Trish said, you're a pretty fierce advocate for this region as well. And you'll be speaking on the Business Council of Australia's economic plans. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you all, if not in person. And it's great to be made, Trish, an honorary citizen of Townsville. I'm very happy to accept that, and really love it every time we do get up there. I'm today on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and can I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. What I thought I'd do, Wade, is just go through briefly our budget submission, which summarises our economic strategy, and then talk about how that unleashes the potential of regions like North Queensland. So we stand back from all of this. What's our task at the moment? Our task is to create jobs and to get people back working. And our estimate is that really you've got to create about 1.5 million jobs, because we've got a lot of churn coming in the economy. We knew that before COVID. That will be accelerated because of COVID. We've also got a 100-year event that has been the worst economic result we've ever seen since modern record keeping has begun. And we can't underestimate the challenge that that presents us, and particularly given that that is a global challenge. And so what we're saying in our economic plan is you can't now lose a second to get in front of the rest of the world. And I'll pick up some of the themes Nev's just talked about. And we accept that for the medium term, that will mean higher debts and higher deficits. But our fundamental narrative, if you will, is that every dollar we're spending now is a dollar that's got to actually position the country to go forward, whether it's creating additional jobs, increasing our rate of growth, making us more competitive, solving major social and economic challenges. And of course, the most central thing is increasing business activity. So our first priority, to Nev's point, is that the economy has to reopen. And we have to live side by side with this virus and focus on these local containments, local lockdowns, rather than these arbitrary state border closures, which are starting to have a serious effect on the performance of our national economy. And we're seeing in states like New South Wales, like South Australia, that local containment, effective digital tracking, tracing and isolation does work. And we do have to prepare ourselves for, to Nev's point, 12 months of working side by side with the virus. So we're saying that National Cabinet needs to develop a 3-month plan to open those domestic borders. And we're calling for a 6-month plan, a very controlled plan, to gradually open our international borders, with a priority on international students and in-demand skilled workers, and then gradually develop those travel corridors with other countries where their infection rates are within safe parameters. And of course, all of that depends on really effective quarantine procedures. One of the things we're arguing here is that we need quickly to start building confidence, and we need to start building predictability and certainty for businesses, and making sure we don't lose our comparative advantages in key areas. For example, international students, we need to be sending a message now that we're open for business in term 1 next year, subject to quarantine. Otherwise, those students potentially choose somewhere else because they'll choose London, they'll choose the US. They're not going to sit and wait for us to make decisions. So that's the first thing, reopen the economy. The second thing is stay open to international investment. And so we're calling for some of the restrictions on the foreign investment review boards thresholds to be lifted immediately, so we start bringing in that foreign capital, because there will be a lot of companies looking for places to invest. The third thing we're calling for, which is I've called for many times, every time I go to Townsville and Cairns, I make this point: we have got to get rid of the barriers on doing business, the red tape that many of you, I know it sends you really into a bad headspace, but it is also a really serious handbrake on job creation. So we're saying, let's not replace some of the antiquated and unnecessary regulation that was abandoned during COVID, things like antiquated freight curfews, antiquated retail trading hours, major project approval processes. Let's not go back to really complex regulatory arrangements. We're also saying, let's take this opportunity to modernise the way business is done, particularly some of the temporary things that are being done in the Corporations Act, electronic signatures, virtual AGMs, electronic distribution of documents. We're also saying we've got to make sure that we retain the changes that have been made to class actions so that companies aren't facing a sway of class actions. And we've also called for a restructuring, a new restructuring arrangement for SMEs, and obviously government announced some fantastic stuff today. In terms of broader economic reform, we're saying switch from stimulus to job creation. So bring forward those stage 2 and 3 personal income tax. Why? Because that's permanent money in people's pockets. We know when you look at the data that people are not necessarily spending JobKeeper, they're saving it. We want people to spend. If you've got some permanent change in your income, people are more likely to spend. We have for a long time supported an increase in job seeker in the New Start allowance, and we're saying, again, that should be urgent reform. We're also asking for some incentives for companies to invest again. And before COVID, we were at very low levels of business investment. It's business investment that creates a work order, that creates activity, that creates a signal to another part of the supply chain. And we know all of the examples in your region. If somebody decides they're going to upgrade their plant and equipment, they create a work order for somebody else. And so we're saying, you know, look at things like an investment allowance. We're saying like a 20% bonus deduction to start getting companies creating that activity, that work order, that book of activity that creates the supply chain. And just to give you a kind of key bit of data in terms of choices, JobKeeper is costing us $12 billion a month to basically stand still. It was a nation-saving initiative, but it has to come to an end because it's now having a distortionary effect. $10 billion in a year would get you an investment allowance like the one we're talking about. It would create 500,000 new jobs over a decade and $200 billion of extra expenditure. And these are the choices that we think are really in front of the government. We're also calling for governments and businesses to unleash their balance sheets and the kind of projects that Nev's talking about. And we've got to have those projects that start to improve our productivity and our economic growth opportunity. So we're calling for a continuous 10-year national revitalisation plan with a pipeline of those big infrastructure projects funded by state, federal governments with the private sector. And that's got to be stuff around the things that, particularly in regions, which I'll come back to, are going to position the country to move forward. And that will also require improvements to the planning system that have basically held back a lot of development. We're calling for an investment in a new energy future to drive down those electricity and gas prices that Nev has talked about. We've got to transition to a lower carbon future. We've got to start picking investment in those projects that are going to reduce our carbon emissions, but are also going to Nev's point, firm up the system and reduce those carbon emissions. And we think there's about $53 billion of investment. Government made some good announcements on that this week. We're calling for removal of these moratoriums on conventional and unconventional gas so that we can actually get that key transition fuel that's part of our economic future. And there are huge opportunities in North Queensland for a kind of energy and revitalisation. We're calling for a kind of real acceleration of the digital economy, particularly focusing on the SME sector. Digital has been good for many people, but for many people in the SME sector, it's not been good. They did not have the key architecture there. And so what are the tax incentives that might bring SMEs into a digital economy in a complete way? As everyone knows that has heard me speak before, skills is a huge area of opportunity. And I'm calling for skills hubs in places like Townsville, where you've got, you know, really, really good skill systems already, strengthening the role of vets, strengthening the role of TAFEs, but also working more closely with universities and starting to move in skills hubs to employer-led training that's linked to the jobs that employers need in those regions. And we break through the long, long, long path to get credentials in this country through more micro-credentialing. We're calling for unlocking the potential of our regions, leverage the city deals, get special activation precincts going, and use that model to identify ways that we can attract not just governments to decentralise, but large corporates to decentralise and put some of those data processing centres, some of their core functions in regional communities. And we need Infrastructure Australia to really make sure that our infrastructure spend is targeting those key regions like the Northern Australian regions that can unlock not just the potential of the region, but the potential of the country. So a big focus on regional Australia. And then finally, to Nev's point, we are calling for a rethink on industry policy. This has been a taboo subject in Australia, which has been very disappointing, I think. It always comes down to a pretty futile conversation about, we can't talk about industry policy because we'd be talking about picking winners. But there's absolutely no doubt we have to do more on research. We have to drive more industry-based research. We have to identify those areas where Australia's got a comparative advantage now, where it must have one in the future in order to be a competitive economy, and then say, what's the role of government to accelerate our progress in those areas? If we don't do that, I feel that we will fall behind as a competitive country. So the way ahead, we think, is this budget has to be about recovery, open, accelerate. The May budget has to be about productivity. And we've got to start laying the groundwork now for a much more productive and competitive economy, because while we're sitting here today having this conversation, I can assure you they're having the same conversation in the UK, the same conversation in the US. Everyone's going to be chasing the same markets as us. We need to give ourselves the best chance of getting those markets, the best chance of getting those jobs. And that's got to be playing to our strengths. And that's got to be, crucially, playing to our strengths in places like the north of Australia and places like Townsville. So I'll stop there, Wade, and
Thanks very much, Jennifer. And we welcome back our panel, Nev and Trish. I guess the question is where to start. We've had a couple of questions come in. I might start with you, Nev, in particular energy and I guess that northwest region. You know, when we obviously advocates for copper string, but lower energy costs, and you know better than anyone just how important that is to unlock the new economy minerals or the rare earths. Is that something that's of strategic importance to the nation?
Yes, absolutely, Wade. And this is an area that we've spent a lot of time on through our commissioners, who's also on the BCA, Catherine Tanner and Andrew Liveris, who was a special advisor to the Commission. They convened some major work and pulled together people from all over industry and different sectors to look at what the impact of that would be. And the key is here that without confidence in long-term, reliable, competitive energy costs, businesses won't invest and continue to develop advanced manufacturing. A lot of our manufacturing businesses that are in the north are very old facilities, some of them 35 and 40 years old. They need to be replaced or revamped, and we need to give those businesses the confidence to invest in them. So our focus was on saying, how do we reset the electricity price? How do we make sure that the transition that we're going through, which is baseload coal to baseload renewables, we're skipping that step that the US and Europe have gone through with baseload gas. Australia has skipped that step altogether on the eastern states. And as we go from baseload coal to baseload renewables, we need to make sure that we continually look at the reliability of the system and allow that transition to happen smoothly and quickly. And that's why we've said gas as a firming medium is the fastest and easiest and most cost-effective way to do that. And we then follow up with things like pumped hydros and batteries and other storage systems. And North Queensland has a lot of potential, as I mentioned before, to do that and combine that with things like the Burdekin dam systems and irrigation schemes. So we think there's a huge opportunity to reset electricity prices in the north to probably even be lower than those in the south of the country so that we can attract manufacturing into those areas. But that is a key issue for us. If I can make a comment on the infrastructure as well, energy infrastructure is one of those things that, as I said, is driven by location. So if we can be focused on virtual power stations where we put generation and firming co-located, then we don't get those high fixed costs. And this could be in major industrial areas like, say, the Burdekin or Tully or the Kidston scheme that's being looked at now. Or it could be community power and distributed power where remote cattle stations or remote communities have got their own generation and firming, and that they're not relying on a fragile and expensive grid to provide all of that power. So I think there are opportunities to do this large scale and small scale.
Thanks, Nev. Jennifer, you mentioned the technology roadmap that was sort of released in the last couple of days. Hydrogen's a big, topic in that. The government wanting to invest $18 billion over the next 10 years. I guess do places like Townsville and in the regions firm up as the right place to start to build those hubs, I guess?
Absolutely. And I think this has kind of got to be part of your economic strategy going forward. And I think the challenge with the energy conversation, it always is either ors, but of course it will be ands, and it'll be plus this, plus that. So it'll be gas plus hydrogen, which ATCO and companies like that are already doing. Our focus has got to be, what's the end game here? The end game is reduce emissions, return to being an energy superpower, and make sure that we are, as part of that, then bringing large-scale manufacturing to key parts of Australia. So I think hydrogen is going to be central to that. But we've got to do that as part of a comprehensive suite of energy products.
Thanks, Jennifer. Trish, I'll come to you. There's a question about, with a lot of people considering moving out of, New South Wales and Melbourne and whatnot to less, I guess, popular towns or regional Australia. Does Townsville and North Queensland play a bit of a role in that to say, come to the regions? I know, Jennifer, you touched on regional head offices, and I guess, if you look at towns in the late 90s, early 2000s, we were the mining hub. We had lots of major miners that had their head offices or their regional head offices in Townsville. Due to the downturn, they sort of brought them back to Melbourne and Sydney. But I think what we're seeing now is a need or even a desire to re-establish those. And I think the region's perfectly placed for that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Wade. And just to touch on some of those points and where we would need some state and federal government support, I think what the North has battled over the years is that we probably hit the national headlines for all the wrong reasons when it comes to the downturn, the drought, the floods. But I do see this period that we're going into as a window of opportunity. And I was speaking with Jennifer and Nev earlier, heading out into the regions now, even out to that corridor, Mount Isa. There does seem to be a buzz amongst our community. We are quite optimistic, but we will still need state and federal government to support us. And one thing that we haven't had, which is we're building on at the moment, is jobs. And I think that's where the state and federal government can play a key role. And I know, Jennifer, you've touched on it, major economic generating precincts, and Nev, you're talking about advanced manufacturing. I think one of the great projects we have here, which is led by Townsville City Council, is our Lansdowne precinct, which is all about advanced manufacturing, a renewable energy hub, touching on hydrogen as well as that green corridor. So I think that is one of the key projects we'd love to see support for, but also those jobs of the new economy. James Cook University is #1 in the world for marine research and science. They're working closely with the hospital and defence on collaborative projects for the new economy and new jobs. And I think that they are exciting, initiatives that can attract talent. And talking about that investment, it is a balance of social and productive infrastructure. We need the jobs, but we need people to love living in Townsville. And I think those that make an effort to try Townsville and the North out, they do want to stay. And I know we've got the group global CEO of Adani online, and he's just texted me. We know they've had to work exceptionally hard to establish a regional headquarters in Townsville. They have committed and they now see over 1,500 people on the books with their regional managers based here. Their CEO is based here. They've had to work hard to attract talent. But a question he's posed to me is, could we even be so bold with this window of opportunity where we offer personal income tax reductions for those that want to move to the regions and attract that talent, which we may have not been able to before? So I don't know. I think that's a great one, Jennifer and Nev, to have your thoughts on, because I think we've got some infrastructure projects we're putting forward, but those added incentives to get regional talent, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think it's worth, personal tax is probably more complicated because it's a national system, but payroll tax relief, definitely. I mean, we are now the most attractive place in the world for people to relocate to. We should be targeting 50 companies around the world and saying, don't just come to Sydney or Melbourne, come to Townsville. bring your data center back, your advanced analytics center. Because I think one of the things, Trish, you and I've talked about this before, is that you've got to get that skill density, to use the jargon. You've got to have, you know, one of these in order for another company to say, well, I'll come to Townsville because I can see that I can get the supply chain, I can see I can get the skills, I can see I can get the kind of people I need. Now that's a bit of central planning, which is a little bit sort of counter to the BCA's economic rationalist agenda, but kind of we're in another world now. And so we might have to do a bit of central planning, whether it's payroll tax, whether it's certainly giving people a much more certain planning future. Like you can't say to companies, come to Townsville, come to regional Australia, by the way, you've got a 5-year planning approval waiting for you. You know, when I talk to companies, because I chair the Aerotropolis in Sydney, it's not so much tax relief they want, it's certainty they want. And it's the skill sets they want. I don't know what you think, Nev.
Yeah, I agree entirely, Jennifer. And I would say, Trish, that to attract companies and people into places like Townsville, it's those facilitating things that Jennifer was talking about. So how can we accelerate planning approvals to make sure that we are attracting the kind of businesses we want? But when they get there, we've thought about the infrastructure, the power, the water, the road infrastructure, the connectivity to port and rail and road, and made sure that we've got the capacity and capability to locate those businesses there. Even if some of it is contingent, putting those plans in place and demonstrating that the city and the region are thinking about the longer term of how to support those businesses so that they're not having to develop all that common use infrastructure themselves from the first investment. The second thing I'd say is getting people to visit the region is the very first step on getting them to relocate there. They need to come there and fall in love with what they're seeing, the people, the vibe. So we need to be thinking about how do we attract, how do we package up our tourism and visitor experiences so that when people come there, they get to see what the region's like, they get to be immersed in the culture and the people so that they understand it. And if they like visiting there, then they're going to start thinking about, well, could my business relocate there? So I'd say those elements are things that can be done and are going to be much more powerful even than a tax incentive, because tax incentives work until someone offers an even greater one to take them back to Brisbane or to take them somewhere else. So, but if you've got people who really like being in the area, that it's easy to do business there, that they feel supported, they've got the infrastructure, they've got good health facilities, education for the kids, they're the sorts of things that mean people come long term and establish and grow their businesses.
The other thing, just quickly, is housing. Like you've got that big Elliott Springs development, but you've got to keep the housing supply going, because if I come there and I've got, at the moment, I can't remember what your median house price is, it's just around 320, I think, isn't it? Something like that. And I mean, that is just like massively attractive. You know, if you're sitting on a $1.5 million house in Sydney and Melbourne, you can relocate to Townsville, you can cash up, you can sort of, retrain, reskill. You kind of offer that as a package to people. It's pretty attractive. But if you don't keep the housing supply going, then, if someone says, well, hang on, it's, $750,000 for me to buy a house, you're not going to get that movement of people.
Yeah, great point, Jennifer. Good points of view. I want to touch on higher education and research. And Neville, I guess we spoke about advanced manufacturing and the manufacturing skills out in the Northwest. But is the narrative now starting to change in terms of research, commercialisation, and then manufacturing in those, I guess hubs? And I know the hospital and JCU are doing some great work out there at the moment with Trop IQ. Is that a bit of a focus for government as well?
Yes, absolutely. And the Commission's been working with Minister Tehan on helping to get greater levels of business engagement in our research and translation, as they call it, from pure research into commercialised outcomes. We think that there is an opportunity for our university sectors, given the impact and the shock that's occurred through the loss of international students and the disruption, that we've got an opportunity to refocus on Australian student outcomes, commercialisation of our research, so more of that stays here in Australia, because everyone is now focused around sovereign capability, and companies that were previously looking to invest offshore superannuation funds, the Future Fund, a lot of the big institutions are now looking at Australia and saying, how can we invest here? So there's money available to invest. We are one of the top research countries in the world, but our translation into commercialised outcomes is very poor. So how do we put business together with universities, create greater collaboration between all the sectors to make sure that we get to keep those great ideas here in Australia and develop them here?
Yeah, very well said. And then I guess another strength of the region, I'll open this up to all the panel, is obviously defence and creating real defence industry. And I think we're seeing some real momentum in that. And I guess, you know, geopolitically, where Townsville is based, we really are in the right position, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely, Wade. I might just talk to that briefly. The PM some time back, I think about a year ago, made a key strategic change to make sure that our defence procurement was looking to engage with Australian businesses. And Defence have an Australian industry capability group, and Minister Price has been very, very strong in supporting local industry and wanting Defence to look to local industry, not only through capital projects, we've seen the big ones like the submarine program, but in sustainment. And this is where the Townsville region can feature very heavily in supplying all of those sustainment provisions into the armed forces because of the presence there. So again, I'd encourage local businesses to seek out and find those opportunities and to try and understand that. All too often it's because of short-term contracts, and if there are opportunities for businesses to package up, to collaborate with other businesses in the areas and put proposals to Defence and make sure that you do copy them to the Minister and into government, then you'll have a very welcome ear from Minister Price and the federal government to try and develop that connection and to have a greater level of Australian involvement in that.
The one comment I'd make in addition to Nev's is I think you've got to be really clear about what role you play in the national defence ecosystem. Not everything in Australia can be a defence hub. There's just not the scale, there's not the kind of market size. I mean, the government has put a lot of money here. So last time I was physically on the ground in Townsville, we went and looked at that kind of potential for running the simulated training and, you know, doing that training for Singapore as well. That whole question of what role you want to play in a national defence industry. Where do you want to play? Where have you got your greatest strengths? How do you build the ecosystem that sits around that? Because there are lots of people who say to me, I want to be a defence hub. And you think, well, have you got the ingredients to be a defence hub? You do, clearly. But what do we mean by a defence hub? And I think this role of training, the simulated training, the autonomous training, you know, I think that's a real opportunity. And playing that as a part of a national strategy, I think is going to really attract government investment.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Another question from the audience. How can we drive the STEM skills agenda further? There's lots of good activity on us at a smaller scale, but we have a huge job ahead of us to have the right skills in place for the future jobs. That's come from Glenna Schuttner. So I'll open that to the panel.
Well, it's a hugely important area, but particularly for young women. I think part of it is got to go right back to secondary school and making sure that we are making it very clear that you cannot leave school unless you've got literacy, numeracy and digital capability. That, you know, if you think about, you know, the three things that people need to leave school with, some kind of academic capability, which creates the ATAR, obviously, some skills that are about workability, and hopefully they've also done some life experience, working, volunteering. But in that academic bit, we have got to make numeracy, mathematics absolutely central. Certainly when I left school, so showing my age, you couldn't get into university unless you'd done mathematics. And so we've got to go right back there. I think we're looking at the wrong data too. We keep looking at STEM qualifications and saying we don't have a problem. When I talk to the companies, they're talking about very specific applied STEM capabilities. They're not talking about people with a computer science degree. So we've got to find a better way of businesses and universities and TAFEs working together to identify what are the STEM skills that they're actually talking about, and then develop a different way of delivering those skills through micro-credentials. Final point I'd make is a lot of kids have fallen behind in the last 6 months, particularly kids in Victoria. You know, I've talked to people whose kids have not been to school for 3 or 4 months. And so one of the things in our budget submission and stuff we submitted earlier to government is we ought to have some STEM accelerators coming into the curriculum now to let kids catch up next year, because they really will. Many kids will have fallen behind, and then they'll start making choices that send them down a pathway that is very hard to come back from.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jennifer. Trish?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the great thing about where we're at is, and to the points Jennifer and Nev have been making, we have developed a roadmap locally of infrastructure projects, of policies and initiatives that we feel at a state and federal level can not just help the local area, but also the state and the nation. So it would be great to get some thoughts and advice. The Northern Australian agenda was, you know, a significant platform for the federal government, and I know it remains a key focus, but some words of advice and guidance to continue putting the North on the national agenda, not just because we're asking for the investment, but because it can actually have a significant impact on the nation's recovery. What are some words of advice to help us get some of these projects and policies committed to moving forward?
Trish, let me say a couple of points to that. I think the best way to approach this is to identify the problems that you're looking to solve. So identify what are the barriers to the greater development of businesses and the greater growth of businesses and enterprise in your area, and use that to say, this is the infrastructure or the changes that we need to really make a difference to that. I think all too often what happens is infrastructure projects bubble up that are sort of iconic infrastructure projects that someone wants to hang their name on or wants to use as a major splash, but they don't actually solve the problems of the area. So I think the more targeted that we can be about, this is what we aspire to develop here, these are the barriers to doing it, this is the enabling infrastructure or processes or policies that we need to do that, and then develop those up so that when they're submitted to things like NAIF, for example, they are a complete solution to a problem, and NAIF provides the final point, or the government assistance provides the final part, or the cherry on top, if you like, to make the investment happen. Because quite often it's not about money, it's about all of those other things, the approval processes and getting it, the common use infrastructure and processes in place to do it. So, like, for example, we use the example of pipelines. It might be just making sure there is enough aggregated demand for gas for manufacturing to underwrite that pipeline, rather than each individual company trying to do it themselves. So it might be just as simple as aggregating together that demand. But I think identifying those areas, identifying the specific problems you're looking to solve, and propose solutions that are actually solving the problems is the best way.
And I'd only add one thing to that, which is to also identify the size of the prize. I mean, anyone, and you've done a lot of this work, Trish, already, but, you know, anyone who takes a business case to a company, the first question is, well, what's the addressable market here? You know, what are our competitors doing? Why would we be in this space, and why would we make investments in it? I think if you kind of break that down and you start saying, well, why the Hell's Gate Dam? You know, here's the addressable market of food and agribusiness and manufactured foods in Asia. Here's what we think the size of the prize is. If we could get 10% of that in Northern Australia, these are the jobs, these are the opportunities, but more importantly, here's the national impact on national GDP. That's how other countries do it. You know, they really are very clear about that size of the prize. And then what are the kind of sequence of projects, to Nev's point, that solve problems that would allow you to get into those addressable markets. So, you know, last time I was up in Cairns, you know, that Mambaloo mango is selling mangoes for $25 a mango in Japan. You just scale that up a bit. You say, what's the barrier to that? Well, It was a lot of freight, logistics, airports, etc. You know, another crossing over the Atherton Tablelands, unleashing that potential of the Atherton Tablelands, you know, you start to get the economic rationale for those projects and make a national story about national economic activity.
Thanks for that, Jennifer. And I think that's great words of advice from both of you. And I know we've had good engagement with your officers, but our North Queensland will be heading down to Canberra again very soon. We think it's time we make a visit, and I'm sure we will be working with both of you on that delegation to make sure the message cuts across on how the North can have such a great impact, not just here locally, but for this country.
Thanks, Trish. Look, we're just about out of time, but before we go, I'd just like to go around to all our panellists. Where do you think the biggest opportunity is for this region? I know it's a difficult question, or if not this region, for regional Australia. Trish, I'll start with you.
I think for us, you know, the great opportunity is around looking at the fundamentals of our economy and just building on it. We've got the industries at the moment that are holding this economy up. So our mining and resources and manufacturing, our agriculture, but we also have the jobs of the future, and that's in the higher education, it's in our defence, and it's also in the rebuilding of tourism, events and hospitality. I think everyone looking at our backgrounds that Wade and I have, there is probably no other place you would want to be right now than in the North. You're right, Nev, we need more visitors here, and I think we'll go on a major campaign to attract visitors here, and hopefully we can convert them into locals. So we've got all the fundamentals. We just need a little bit of support from state and federal government, but the private sector will do the rest.
Thanks, Trish. Nev?
Yeah, look, I think just building on what Trish has said, it's about making sure you've got a diversified economy. So I'd be looking right across the economy and saying, where have we got comparative advantage right across every area of it, and really go hard up over those areas that you do have that comparative advantage. So obviously resources and mineral processing is a huge opportunity, but as Trish said, all of those other areas, agriculture is huge. Queensland and North Queensland is the biggest cattle production area in the country. We've got phenomenal opportunity there to keep expanding on that with improved pastures, so getting our irrigation systems out, doing more finishing of our beef before we put it to market. Doing those sorts of things are huge opportunities. And it's, let's face it, it's part of the greatest country in the world, and it's a beautiful place to visit. So we need to set it up so that we can attract people out of their burrows down south and come up and see our wonderful country. And then, as Trish said, hopefully they'll stay. So I think it's about looking right across the economy and saying, where have we got those comparative advantages and how do we maximise the leverage from that?
Great. Thanks, Nev. And Jennifer?
Look, same sort of message. I mean, we're sitting in Australia still on the doorstep of the biggest market in history, which is a middle class in Asia. That's not going to go away. It may be slower, but it's not going away. So the opportunities in those areas of comparative advantage that Nev just went through, and it's about mapping that out, mapping out the size of that prize, identifying the strengths you've got now, and where, if you made certain adjustments, you get to another scale that would actually then have this national flow-on effect. It is also, I think, playing to your strengths as a security area. To me, the Northern Australia story is still fundamentally a story about our national security. And we've got to make sure that we remind Australians that, you know, if we do not develop the North, we are making ourselves very vulnerable if we don't take that opportunity. And I think it's about making sure that on the tourism front, I think this is a question for the whole of Australia. Probably not something to throw in right at the end, but it is important. I think we've got to say the product's got to be better. The product offering has got to be better. And now isn't time where I think that tourist operators have really got to say, is our product offering as good as it could be, so that we prepare ourselves for the eventual reopening of the economy. Great.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. That is literally all we have time for. I do really want to sincerely thank our panellists. Neville Power, thank you for your time. I know you're very busy, and we appreciate you giving up your time to be here. Jennifer Westacott, always great to chat to you, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Townsville sometime soon. And Trish, thank you for your time. And thank you for your time today joining for this webinar. Hope you've enjoyed it. Next Wednesday, we've got our next webinar and it's on defence. We'll be talking about Townsville City Council's new defence strategy. We'll have David Burke, John Caligari, Dr. John Crosby and Tony Tucker joining us, as well as Mark Hone from Cubic. Registration details will be sent out in our next EDM. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day and good afternoon.
Thanks very much.